Hey guys, welcome back. So this is going to be our lecture for Wednesday, March 25th, and we're going to be talking about the federal government's response to the Great Depression, right? The stock market collapse, what the federal government did at the beginning, things that they did that were positive, some things that they did that were very negative, right? That led to a drastically different outcome than what we might have had proper policy been in place at the beginning. Okay, so let's get started. By early 1931, the economy was in shambles. Stock prices had plunged, banks were closing, manufacturers were incapable of selling their product. Think about that for a second, right? Manufacturers, right? People that are hiring a mass number of people, right? Factory owners, so on and so forth. Service industry workers, so on and so forth. They can't sell their product because people don't have any money, which then leads to layoffs, which then means people losing their homes, people not being able to pay down debt, so on and so forth. You can really see the domino effect of what's going on here. Yes, the stock market collapse, a massive piece of the Great Depression, but that's just the first of many dominoes that are going to fall that lead to very, very difficult times. Okay, now, the federal government, under the leadership of President Herbert Hoover, took measures to improve the situation. Unfortunately, the measures that the president took made a bad situation worse. Okay, and we're going to talk about some of the decisions that were made. So, moving on to the next slide, the Fed. Numerous economists blame the Federal Reserve System, which is commonly referred to as the Fed, for further weakening the U.S. economy in 1930 and 1931. The Fed manages the nation's money supply and determines the amount of money available for circulation among investors, producers, consumers, so on and so forth. All right? Really think of money circulating in an economy in the same fashion of money circulating in our bodies. All right? As blood comes from your heart, all right? Oxygenated blood goes out into your body. It refreshes your muscles. Deoxygenated blood goes into your lungs, picks up that oxygen back out into your body, right? That's your circulatory system. That's what keeps us alive. Our economy is similar to that. Producers produce, consumers consume, and around and around and around we go. However, if consumers do not have money, producers have no one to sell to, right? If you're not selling items, right, and people aren't making money, tax revenue is viciously undercut, right? And you see a very, very bad situation becoming much, much worse. Now, what we would have hoped in 1929 is that the Fed would expand money supply. And what they did was they contracted, right? They moved inwards, and it made a dwindling money supply even smaller. It made a bad situation much worse, right? And we can take a look at how that's going to happen. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Adjusting the interest rate. One way the Fed adjusts the money supply is by setting the discount rate, or rate of interest, at which banks belonging to the federal system can borrow money from the Federal Reserve banks. Member banks use the Fed discount rate to determine the interest rate at which you can charge borrowers. Now, as we're sitting here today, last week President Trump actually, well, not President Trump, but at the guidance of President Trump, the Fed cut interest rates but somewhere between 0 and 0.25%. That is astoundingly low, and that's going to hopefully help many businesses that are going to feel some very difficult economic times on the horizon, right? We just saw Governor DeSantis shut all bars and nightclubs for the next 30 days. Those businesses are going to need help. They're going to need access to that money. It's a good thing that our federal government is increasing circulation. In 1929, they decreased circulation, right? They slowed down that flow of money. It'd be like slowing down the flow of blood in your body. It's going to make you weaker, right? You're not going to be nearly as effective. All right, moving on to the next slide. So before the stock market crashed, the Fed kept interest rates low. They wanted people to have access to money. Not only people, but businesses, right? Think about if you're a small business and you really do need that seed capital. Unless you go public, right, and you have an IPO and you raise money through the stock market, you are going to need to get money from a bank. Many businesses would do this. Low interest rates encouraged it, right? If you felt like the interest rate was competitive, you felt like you could get your hands on money, get yourself up and running in a quicker fashion than if interest rates were much higher. Unfortunately, when the system comes down, the interest rates go way up. Now, one reason that you need to be careful with low interest rates is it's not all good. Low interest rates can actually encourage excessive borrowing, right? People borrowing money with no real economic plan, not only for how to recoup the interest, but how to pay off the principal. This is going to be a major problem in 1920. In fact, many people would take these federally backed loans and then invest them in the stock market. And when the stock market collapsed, again, you can really just start to tie all of these things together and see how one problem leads to 2, leads to 4, leads to 8, and so on and so forth. So the U.S. economy grinds to a halt. Again, moving on to our next slide. Following the crash, Federal Reserve officials maintained low interest rates for a time, but they would begin to raise them quite a bit, and this would restrict the flow of money throughout the system. If you look at the graph that we can see there, you will see Black Tuesday, and then you will see the beginnings of what becomes the New Deal. You see how money is really being restricted from the time the stock market collapsed. The amount of money in our system decreases significantly. Once the New Deal comes along, right, that amount of money begins to flow, right? And it allows our system to bounce back. And we're going to talk about FDR and some of the programs he created that really did help our country bounce back. Now, many people had already stopped spending. Okay, understand this. Even though we're restricting the flow of money, most people at the time had stopped spending. All right, there was really no discretionary spending. The only money you had, you were going to make sure you spent it on essentials, food, your home, so on and so forth. Outside of that, you weren't spending much. Okay, now this is harming producers. It certainly slowed production. Higher interest rates made businesses even more deprived of necessary capital, right? So again, a bad situation becoming worse. This would truly incapacitate much of our economy. Now, as the amount of money dwindled, the economy slowed significantly, like an animal going into hibernation in a lot of ways, right? Our economy is retreating. Now, the United States in the 1920s to an extent, but certainly today, was a major player in the global economy. When the United States has a downturn, it affects everyone around the world, right? Many of those countries that we discussed during the First World War, this Great Depression is going to hit them as hard, if not harder, specifically the country of Germany, right? Germany, we talked about the massive war reparations. Well, they were really robbing Peter to pay Paul on those war reparations. They were borrowing money from us to repay other countries. Well, when we go under, they have no one to borrow from. You can see what's going to happen in Germany, right? They're on the path, a very destructive path, and that's what our next topic's going to be on. Okay. So expansion is opposed to contraction. Next slide. If Federal Reserve officials had concentrated on expanding the money supply, it could have blotted the truly massive downturns of the Great Depression. It very well could have. Now, more money in circulation would have stimulated the economy to grow by making loans less expensive, right? You have to pay the banks back less. Right? Think about if you're a business and you're going to get a loan for $50,000 and you owe the bank exactly $50,000. That is unheard of, right? That's the situation that we're in today, all right, with our interest rates being as low as they are. It really is unprecedented times. Unfortunately, during the Great Depression, those were not the moves that were made, and it led to negative outcomes where really people needed positive outcomes, maybe at that time more than any other. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. What happens when you don't face your problems? You turned inward, right? We didn't face the problems head on. And by not facing the problems head on, by going into that economic hibernation, so to speak, you would start to see things like this all over the country, right? Take a look at that picture that you see there, right? Those are things known as Hoovervilles all over the country. People lost their homes. People lost everything, absolutely everything. And these are the situations, almost shanty towns, right, that people were living in right here in the United States of America. Now, instead of expanding, the Fed would allow the supply of money to drop by nearly 33%, one third, right? So if we're just talking about ourselves, cut out 1/3 of the money that you spend. Multiply that by all of your friends. Multiply that by all of the country. How many businesses are going to go out of business? How many people are going to lose their job? It's going to be a significant amount of Americans that are going to find themselves in a situation just like this, living in things like Hoovervilles all over the country. It took a bad situation and truly turned it into a calamity. All right. Moving on to the next slide. Economists also blame Congress for making decisions that further aggravated economic woes. To understand this, one needs to look beyond the United States and really look overseas. I had kind of alluded to it, right? Moving on to the next slide. World War I left much of Europe in economic shambles. Europe was in a bad place. I mean, we talked extensively about the First World War, so you guys know the realities of what took place over there. Rebuilding not only a nation, rebuilding a continent was going to be extraordinarily difficult to begin with. Rebuilding a continent with 1/3 of the resources is going to be near impossible. People are going to be put in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. All right? Now, Germany was the country that fared the worst. All right? The Germans were only able to afford the reparation payments to the Allies by borrowing from the United States. Well, the Fed just cut the money supply by 1/3, and hardly any of that money to begin with was going to Germany. So Germany is getting virtually nothing, which means the Treaty of Versailles now becomes virtually worthless. It's going to empower the more radical elements within that society, specifically National Socialists. You guys would know them as Nazis. It's going to empower them and embolden them. It's going to make them look at the Treaty of Versailles and wonder if anyone would even bother enforcing it. I think you see where I'm going with this. Okay. Now, to earn the money required to pay off the debts, European nations desperately needed to sell large amounts of goods in the United States. We don't have any money, which means we cannot buy European goods. And if we're going to buy goods at all, we want them to be for American businesses. This leads to a trade war, right? We enact protectionist measures for our producers. Europe enacts protectionist measures for their producers in Europe. So instead of trying to have a system of comparative advantage, right? Say Europe can produce something for 10 times less than the United States. We want to import that good. We want to buy that good. That's cheaper. But with these protectionist tariffs, we make it impossible for the benefits of trade to occur. We move inward. We are not trying to move outward. By moving inward, the cost of everything goes up. Right? This triggers an even worse economic situation. So we're talking about people having less money to begin with, the money supply being restricted, virtually eliminating the benefits of trade, right, you can see how our economy is collapsing. It's a very, very difficult spot to be in, and it would lead to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt being elected not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. Okay, so as we are wrapping up with this lesson, okay, I hope you guys are well. When we pick back up, we will be talking about Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, have a wonderful day and stay safe. Bye.